My name is Preacher. I'm 80 years old, and I want to begin with something that I lived with for most of my life, without ever quite naming it clearly enough to work with it directly. My thinking patterns were not random. They were not the spontaneous product of each fresh moment meeting my awareness. They were habits, deep, old, invisibly repetitive habits that ran beneath nearly everything I experienced and interpreted and decided without my ever fully seeing that they were running. And the reason I could not see them for so long was precisely the same reason that makes any habit difficult to see. It felt like reality, not like a pattern through which reality was being filtered, like reality itself. The thought that I was not enough appeared, and was received not as a thought, but as a fact. The interpretation that difficulty meant something was fundamentally wrong arrived not as an interpretation, but as obvious truth. The tendency to see the threatening possibility before the workable one registered not as a habit of mind, but as clear-eyed realism. All of these patterns, and the many others that constituted the particular shape of my thinking, were so familiar and so constant that they had become transparent. Like the water a fish swims in, present everywhere, noticed almost nowhere. The silent discipline that changes thinking patterns is the practice of learning to see what you have been seeing through. And that learning, which is the work of genuine mindfulness in the deepest sense, happens not through analyzing your thinking or replacing your thoughts with better ones or following a program designed to restructure your cognitive patterns. It happens through something much quieter and much more intimate than any of those things. It happens through the patient, repeated, honest practice of witnessing your own mind while it is doing what it does, not afterward, not in reflection, in real time, in the actual moment when the pattern is active. Maybe you have noticed that certain situations reliably produce certain kinds of thoughts, that particular people or particular circumstances or particular types of challenge consistently summon a recognizable inner weather. Maybe you have noticed that your mind tells certain kinds of stories about yourself, or about others, or about what is possible, or what is safe. If any of that is true, stay with me, because the discipline I want to describe does not ask you to stop having those patterns. It asks you to see them clearly enough that they begin to lose the authority of inevitability. I was born in northern Thailand and entered the monastery with thinking patterns I did not know I had. That is almost always how it is. The patterns that most shape your life are the ones you are least aware of, because they have been present since before you had the capacity to step back from your own experience and examine what was happening. My particular patterns included a tendency to interpret uncertainty as threat, a habit of self-evaluation that was never quite satisfied, a particular way of understanding authority that made some relationships more complicated than they needed to be, and a background assumption about the nature of safety that had been reasonable in the circumstances of my childhood, and had become entirely context inappropriate by the time I was a grown man in a monastery that was actually quite safe. None of these patterns were obvious to me at first. What was obvious was their content, the thoughts themselves. the specific fears and judgments and interpretations that the patterns produced. But the patterns, the repeated shapes that generated similar thoughts across very different situations, were invisible because they were the lens rather than the image. And the silent discipline that began to change them was not the practice of attacking the images. It was the gradual development of the capacity to see the lens. The first element of this silent discipline is stillness. Not the dramatic stillness of extreme practice, the ordinary stillness of simply stopping for long enough to notice what is happening in the mind before moving into the next thing. Most people's relationship to their own thinking is almost entirely retrospective. They notice what they thought after the thought has already generated its emotional and behavioral consequences. The silent discipline requires that gap to be shortened, that the noticing happen earlier. And the only way to develop that earliness is through the regular practice of creating moments of genuine stillness in which the mind can be observed rather than simply inhabited. This does not require an elaborate practice. It requires the consistent return to moments where the mind is not being actively directed toward any task, and where the content of consciousness can be noticed honestly. What is here right now? What is the mind doing? What kind of thinking is this? What pattern does this resemble? These questions, asked not with the urgency of problem solving, but with the genuine curiosity of honest inquiry, are the beginning of seeing the lens. The second element is what I would call noticing without narrating. The habitual mind, when it is observed, immediately begins to narrate what it is observing. A thought appears, and the mind says, "This is the old pattern again," or "This is what always happens," or "This shows that I still have not changed," or "This is proof that things are getting better." All of that narration is more thinking. It is the thinking about thinking that the mind produces when it is given something to think about. And while that meta-thinking has its uses in reflection and inquiry, in the actual moment of practice, it is often what prevents the clear seeing that the discipline is designed to produce. Noticing without narrating is the practice of seeing a thought simply as what it is, without immediately producing commentary about it. The commentary itself is worth noticing, eventually, but beginning with the simpler practice of seeing without immediately explaining what you see is more foundational. It is the difference between awareness and conceptual processing. And awareness, genuine awareness without the constant overlay of conceptual processing, is what actually changes thinking patterns over time. Not because it replaces one set of concepts with another, because it introduces a quality of presence that is different in kind from any content of thought. The third element is patient repetition without expectation of dramatic results. This is the silent part of the silent discipline. Genuine change in thinking patterns is not visible from the outside and rarely feels dramatic from the inside. It happens in small increments, through thousands of unremarkable practice moments, through the accumulation of a quality of presence that gradually becomes more natural, more available, more the default way the mind operates rather than a special achievement of deliberate effort. And here's what I didn't understand then. I expected my thinking to change in ways I could observe and measure. I expected to have fewer unwanted thoughts, to experience less of the patterns I had identified as problematic, to feel a clear and recognizable improvement in the quality of my inner life. And sometimes those things happened. But the deeper change was quieter than that. It was a change in the relationship between me and my thoughts, rather than a change in the thoughts themselves. The patterns were still present, many of them, but they were no longer quite as invisible. They had become recognizable as patterns rather than as reality. And that recognizability, however partial and inconsistent, was a different kind of freedom than I had been looking for. The fourth element is the acceptance of the patterns you find, without making that acceptance mean that they will never change. This is a delicate balance that took me many years to develop. On one side is the harshness that treats every recurring pattern as a moral failure and makes the practice of honest observation into a source of ongoing shame. On the other side is the premature acceptance that uses the understanding that patterns change slowly as a reason to not genuinely engage with the practice. The middle path, which is also genuinely the Buddhist middle path, is honest acceptance of what is present right now, combined with genuine commitment to the patient practice that allows genuine change over time. Seeing the pattern clearly, accepting that it is here, without making that acceptance mean that it must stay, and returning to the practice with something like genuine care rather than urgency or resignation. You know what surprised me most? The patterns that I accepted most honestly, that I could look at most clearly without shame or urgency, were the ones that changed most. And the patterns I fought most fiercely, that I was most determined to eliminate, were the ones that persisted longest. This seems paradoxical, but it makes a certain kind of sense. When you fight a pattern, you are feeding it your attention and your energy. When you accept it honestly, you are simply seeing it. And what is clearly seen, without the fuel of resistance and shame, tends naturally to move towards something more workable over time. The fifth element is the application of the practice not to abstract thinking, but to real situations as they arise. The silent discipline that changes thinking patterns does not happen primarily in meditation or formal practice. It happens in the moment when a familiar situation arrives and the familiar pattern begins to activate. When the person who triggers your particular sensitivity says the thing, when the circumstance that reliably produces your particular kind of anxiety presents itself, when the inner critic that lives in a specific register begins its familiar commentary. Those moments are not interruptions of the practice. They are the practice. They are where the earlier development of stillness and honest seeing finds its actual application. In those moments, what the practice makes available is not the absence of the pattern. The pattern will arise. It has been doing this for a very long time. What becomes available with practice is a slightly earlier awareness of the arising, a slightly wider gap between the pattern and the response, a slightly greater capacity to recognize what is happening before it has completely taken over. And in that slight increase, that small addition of awareness and space, a different quality of response becomes possible. Not always, not immediately, not without continued practice, but genuinely. And that genuine possibility, slowly expanded through years of patient practice, is how thinking patterns actually change. The sixth element is the understanding that changing thinking patterns is ultimately about changing the relationship you have with your mind, rather than changing the mind's contents. This is a subtle but important distinction. Most approaches to changing thinking patterns are aimed at the contents, at producing better thoughts, more positive thoughts, more rational thoughts. The silent discipline aims at something different, at developing a quality of presence that is not entirely at the mercy of whatever thought or pattern happens to be active, at discovering that you are not simply whatever is happening in your mind, but something that includes and is aware of what is happening there. That discovery, when it begins to be genuinely lived, rather than just intellectually understood, changes the relationship more fundamentally than any change in the specific contents of thought could. At 80 years old, my thinking patterns are not what they were at 30. Some of them are genuinely different. Some of the same patterns are still present, but they are thinner, less authoritative, more recognizable as the patterns they are, rather than as the reality they used to appear to be. And the practice that produced that change was not dramatic. It was this quiet, patient, repeated practice of honest witnessing, day after day, in small moments that felt inconsequential, in the gradual accumulation of a slightly wider awareness across many years of ordinary life. What changed was not primarily the thinking. What changed was the relationship to the thinking. And that change, quiet as it was, changed something that turned out to be more important than almost anything else. Tell me in the comments what thinking pattern you notice most consistently in your own mind. Not to judge it, just to name it honestly. Because naming it is the beginning of seeing it, and seeing it genuinely and without the urgency of needing it to immediately be different is the beginning of the silent discipline that changes it. And if this message gave you something real to return to, stay close to this space, because the discipline that changes thinking patterns is exactly as it says, silent, patient, persistent, and genuinely transformative in the ways that matter most.